PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Jim McClure about his book, Never to be Forgotten, A History of York County, Pennsylvania.
This week on PA Books, Jim McClure, author of Never to be Forgotten.
Jim McClure is the author of Never to be Forgotten, A History of York County, Pennsylvania. Jim, your book is filled with all kinds of stories from York County's history going back to the 1700s. What's a favorite story of yours?
Yeah, one of the favorite stories is about a person, and that person is Flo Snyder Neff. And she was started in York Corporation, made air heating and cooling equipment in World War II, and still is around today as Johnson Controls. She worked in the office there, and she would write poetry, and that poetry was sent out in the company newsletter to to hundreds of servicemen overseas. So she would write poetry of hope, and they were actually prayers. And so you can imagine if these servicemen were in and women who are in the service as well were overseas and get this letter from home from this woman in the office at York Corporation just giving them hope. They would believe that they haven't actually been forgotten. And so she then went on to a career in nursing, guidance counseling, and later cared for her parents, and her in-laws who were in their old age. So there's a person that lived a complete life, starting, as a clerk, doing clerk work, but writing poetry on the side that gave people hope.
Now, your book is organized almost like an encyclopedia, but chronologically, with entries telling different stories and different aspects of history. How did you decide what to include?
Yeah, that's always the question. I started with the book in 1999, 25 years ago, and that was in conjunction with the 250th anniversary of York County. And then 25 years passed, and I had 25 years more material and research that I had done, and so it was even tougher the second time to decide what to leave out and what to add, because I just had more information. But I did end up doubling the size of the book, and that helped. Really, one of the things that you do is you create a timeline, and then you work according to that timeline, so you make sure that you don't miss anything big, like some important figure like William C. Goodrich, for example. Another thing that modern historians and American studies practitioners like myself and journalists do is they try to tell the complete history that includes history involving race, class, and gender. So you gotta make sure that in all periods that you're considering women, you're considering people of color, and then in the class area, which is often overlooked, you need to continually look to make sure that you're not just talking about the upper echelon in the community. So you have those filters that you work through, timeline plus those filters, and you come up with a book.
How did you do research? What were your main sources?
Yeah, I started in the 1990s, got my master's degree at Penn State Harrisburg in American Studies, and I was studying York County newspaper history. So I was coming across a lot of stories when you look at miles of microfilm about York County over the ages. And I started collecting those stories and trying to understand the wars and I think of history as you need to look at the river for sure. The main things, the wars, the main things that impact community, but you also need to look at the banks as well, the stories about how people live and work and play. And so I had those ideas in mind as I was collecting stories, looking at the 250th of York County coming up. And so I I had a book at that point, and then about 3 years ago, I was aware that the 275th anniversary was coming up, and so I started collecting even more stories at that point. So, but as American Studies guy, I really pull from all kinds of places, not just from microfilm, but also from interviews, ethnographies, local history books that others have written. So anything's in play, and I tried to create a major bibliography in the back to show others all the sourcing that's out there.
How important are the old newspaper records to the type of research that you do?
Yeah, that they're very important, and they've become even more important in recent years because of the advent of newspapers.com, which is a database that you can search on any year. As long as the newspapers in your community are online, you can search for any year and any term going back to when the newspapers were first published. In York County, that goes back to 1796. And actually, the newspapers are online in York County only back to 1815, but that's a lot of history. So I think newspapers have become even more important because you have the ability to do searches rather than just rolling microfilming and hoping you'll run across something.
Can you talk a little bit about the origins of York County?
Yeah, it's interesting. As you go across the southern tier of York County, most of the counties that formed did so because they needed sheriff's protection, and they were too far from the county seat to get the types of protection they needed. For example, York, you had to cross the Susquehanna River to go into Lancaster County, and that was a long trip. So in 1749 or 1747, the people of York County said, we need help over here, and furthermore, we're willing to pay taxes to get that help, which is probably the only time in York County's history that people offered to pay taxes. And 2 years later, the State General Assembly approved it, and York became a county in 1749. At that time, York County extended from the Susquehanna River all the way to Adams County, to the top of the mountain in Adams County today. Adams County split from York County in 1800, and at that time, York County boundaries became what they are today, about 900 square miles.
Who were the Native American peoples who lived in what is now York County? Yeah,
the main group that we write about and talk about is the Susquehannocks. They were matrilineal group, which means that women had a say in the decision-making in the camps. And for example, with the Susquehannocks, the women, as a general rule, would work in the fields. The men, as a general rule, would fish and harvest the river for food. And so they came about 1585, and they were around in one form or another on both sides of the Susquehanna up until about 1763. In the 1760s, there was what was called the Conestoga Massacre, and that was when some groups, Scots-Irish groups from Lancaster County at the time, came down, and really Pakistan today, and came down, and in a series of attacks really almost wiped out the Susquehannocks, or Conestogas as they were called at the time. So they were the dominant group. And one of the things about the American Indians in York County was that William Penn had this idea that he followed, that you couldn't move onto land until there was a treaty with the American Indians. And so that led to a modicum of peace, at least in York County, because in York County, you didn't have to hold a rifle or a musket in one hand and a plow in the other. There was relative peace, so the farmers could get, after they moved onto the land in the 1730s, could do their work on the fields, and that helped York County, as I say, got off to a great start that way.
Now, one of the key geographical barriers was the Susquehanna River for east-west movement. Early on, there would be a ferry set up there in what is now Wrightsville. And can you talk about the origins of that ferry and how significant was it to York County's development?
Yeah, it was John Wright ferry, and the Wright family was a Quaker family that was dominant in Lancaster County and early York County, and it was the main way to get across. There's other ferries as well, but it was the main ferry to get across from between Columbia today and Wrightsville today, and not only for folks moving, local folks, but also the Great Wagon Road across there, and that was a way you can imagine, Germans, immigrants getting off in Germantown and coming across, and they would come across the Wright's Ferry, come across York County, and go down into the Shenandoah Valley through Harper's Ferry and other gaps, and so the ferry really helped open up America in a way. Even today, folks from the South come up to do genealogical research in York County, because the relatives pass through there. And often they would not just pass through, but they would stop and farm for a period of time, and then they would go down into the valley and down into the south. So that north-south orientation has always been a key part of York County. Also, settlers would head west to the western frontier in Pennsylvania as well. So that ferry was well used, and the other ferries along the Susquehanna as well.
You mentioned the Germans. Can you talk about some of the different ethnicities of the settler groups that ended up in York County?
Yeah, early on, the Germans were the main group, and they were farmers, and they loved that Central Valley in York County that was really carved out by the Kreitz, Cadorus, and Conewago Creeks. So they got that rich limestone soil in the central part of York County. But also the Scots-Irish came, and Scots-Irish, they were farmers, but they didn't require quite the same caliber of land, and so they were in the hilly area of the southeastern part near Delta and Peach Bottom today, and the northwestern part near Dealsburg and in those northern regions. And then the third group were the Quakers, and the Quakers were in several settlements, including in New York, but many of the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, settled north of the Conewago. The Conewago is a creek that splits York County into about a third and two-thirds. And that creek, and then the Quakers established a band of meeting houses, maybe 5 meeting houses across that northern tier. And so they would be English. So those are the 3 other groups. There were other groups, of course, the Scots-Irish, the Scots-Irish and Germans also brought enslaved people. And that's how York County, in 1790, in that first census, York County was first in Pennsylvania in number of enslaved people, 499. And York County was second in freedmen in that year. So in part because the settlers brought enslaved people. In other cases, we had such a connection with the South, which was already, in Maryland, for example, was a slave state up until Civil War. So, it was, so York County was maybe more, had more mixture of ethnicities and races than maybe you might think for a frontier county.
Now, York County does border Maryland, as you mentioned, but in the 1700s, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland wasn't established, and that led to some conflicts between the 2 colonies. One key figure in those was Thomas Cressup. Who was he, and what was he trying to accomplish?
Yeah, it was the Calverts of Maryland versus the Penns of Pennsylvania, and each had a different definition of where, of where their line ran. And so when the Marylanders moved into it's the kind of the Wrightsville area, right south of Wrightsville, if you're familiar with that. And they moved. Thomas Cressup was kind of their lead agent, and he represented Maryland's interests, whether officially or unofficially. He was a fiery sort, and he caused conflict and even bloodshed. Some would say that he was a hero in doing so, if you're a Marylander, and others would say, that it was all unnecessary. And that really led to the Crown saying, we really have to decide, where that line is going to run. So years later, they sent Mason and Dixon, the surveying team, to, to lay the boundary across southern Pennsylvania. One of the features of that line, when they ran it, and it's pretty accurate as to where it is today, is that York County before 1800 had a 65-mile border with Maryland. And just as a comparison, Lancaster's border is 6 miles with Maryland. So you can see that the development, how those different counties developed. Lancaster, because they didn't have that large border, a wide border to trade with Maryland, would have gravitated more to Philadelphia and the Quaker influence in Philadelphia. And whereas York County, with a 65-mile border, had all kinds of trade connections with the South, including the Port of Baltimore. And so York County connected with Baltimore, Lancaster County connected with Philadelphia. And it kind of shaped the way those counties developed over the course of time. So that Mason-Dixon line, really the study of York County is a study of a frontier county, the first county west of the Mississippi, Susquehanna in Pennsylvania, in the fifth in Pennsylvania, and the first west of the Susquehanna. And so it's a study of how a frontier county really developed over the course of time.
Talk more about that connection with Maryland. Was there a political effect within the county that differentiated it from what was going on in Lancaster?
Yeah, initially York County was a Federalist county, meaning they would side with the first congressman was a Federalist, a friend of George Washington. But as time passed, there were, the Whiskey Rebellion, Alien Sedition Act. The people in York County said, "Wait a minute, we just fought a revolution against the, against the Crown. We didn't like some of the unilateral things that the Crown did, and now we're getting that again from our federal government." So York County kind of flipped to the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian ideas of states' rights, and it fit the rural nature of York County better anyway. So York County became, in those days, was a Democratic county. And because the trade was with the South, the railroad was with the South, and that what that meant was York County voted democratically from 1800 to 1904, flipped in 1904 to Teddy Roosevelt versus Alton Parker, and then went back to Democrat until 1920. Woodrow Wilson's policies tended to be a little interventionist and heavy-handed for York Countyans, so York County went with the Republicans in the 1920s before flipping back to Roosevelt, Democrat. So one of the impacts of York County being Democrat, really it was a Democrat, a kind of a moderate Democrat, often in the Civil War called Copperheads. And the Copperhead position was basically, we're not abolitionists by any means, but we're not pro-slavery. We just think that the Constitution will remain as it is, the Union as it is, and slavery, black people where they are. And that was the overriding thing. So when Lincoln came into office in 1860, or was running for office, York County said, wait, he's going to break up, he'll be against that mantra in every way. He's going to cause things to change, and there'll be a war, and we don't want war, and so we're going to stake out this Copperhead position. So we voted against Abraham Lincoln by 1,500 votes. In 1860, of course, Pennsylvania voted for Lincoln. In 1864, we voted against Abraham Lincoln by 3,000 votes, and of course, York County, Pennsylvania voted for Lincoln. So we had that tendency that. It's the way I say it is we're kind of a northern county with a southern orientation, or a southern county with a northern orientation, but we're kind of have our own identity in a way. We're not, someone said in York County, we're not too hot, not too cold, but pretty York County in our own way.
Now, throughout the book, you talk about some of the first people to come into the communities, and some of those names are still around. People are familiar with Rutter's convenience store and dairy, and right. You point out that in 1747, Jacob Rutter received a land grant, and that begins their presence in the county. What do you learn about how the county evolves by looking at a family like that, and how their business evolved?
Yeah, the York County and the Rutters as well. There was a moment that York County flipped to what you would call an industrial county. And the Rudders fought through that, and they're, of course, with us today. They changed their business model and in some ways to become convenience stores today. But that moment I talked about earlier came in 1887. And up to that point, there had always been market sheds in the center, York, at the center of York County is York, and that's where Market Street, which is the Lincoln Highway, and the George Street, which is the Susquehanna Trail, cross. And in that center area, since 1755, there have been market sheds. In 1787, those market sheds came down, pulled down in the middle of the night, apart from any court or police action. It was basically a middle of the night raid to pull down those market sheds. And I look at that as the moment where York County changed from agrarianism as a dominant industry to industrialization. Of course, or development, if you want to call it that. Because at that point in 1887, the trolleys were coming in, horse-drawn at the time. The trolleys moved product through, but the trolleys also moved people through to work in the factories. So if those market sheds were blocking the way, then something had to give. The market sheds gave. Trolleys came through. Those red brick factories that made York one of the mightiest defense contractors in World War II, won the day. Now, the farmland, interestingly, in York County switched from agricultural usage to industrial or some other usage besides agriculture in about 100 years later, in 1984. So it doesn't mean that farmers like Rudder shut down at that point. It just meant that kind of the philosophy of the county changed at that symbolic moment. And Rudders today they still farm, and but they're up against an interesting thing when we talk about development, because now you have Wawa coming in and you have Sheetz is there, and you have Turkey Hill. So it's kind of a battleground for all these dairy stores coming together and competing in which was in an area that was once a prime agricultural area.
So in the early 1770s, the revolutionary movement is emerging in the 13 colonies. How did residents of York respond to things like the Boston Tea Party and some of the other events that were happening at that time?
Well, like in most wars, many communities in many wars, early in the war, there's a certain amount of patriotism, and that was the case in York. So York did rally early and sent a company to Boston when it was besieged by the British in 1775. And whenever the Declaration of Independence in 1776 reached York County, then it was a big deal. There's a signer of the Declaration from York County, James Smith. York County's American Revolution pedigree really does date to 1777. That's when the Continental Congress came to York County. This is one of the marquee moments in York County's history, and York County will be celebrating the 250th of that in 2027, a year after the Declaration of Independence 250th. And the Continental Congress came there, forced out of Philadelphia, and met in Lancaster for a day, no room at the inn there, came across the Susquehanna, loved that river as a buffer, although they were nervous about that river as a buffer. And then because you could splash across that river in certain places if you were a British raiding party. They settled in York, and there's where some tension started, because you'd have these crotchety statesmen who were overworked and away from their families, and with a price on their heads, with important business to do, and they moved into homes and moved into taverns. Prices went up, food was scarce. They would complain, but it was when they left 9 months later, America had a constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And so it was a time of bravery and accommodation, and a time that York County justifiably hangs its hat to this day.
Now, one of the key figures that you mentioned, James Smith, he appears again and again throughout his life in York County. Who was he, and what are some of the significant roles that he played?
Yeah, he was a lawyer, and in those days, and maybe in many communities, but in York in those days, lawyers held a heavy sway because, how do you really run a county under a new constitution, under a new government? When British government was, we protested against them and rebelled against them, how do you run county government? And so the lawyers had a key role. So he served in the state legislature, signed the first state constitution, signed the Declaration of Independence, and a lot isn't known about him, interestingly, but because his law office was burned in the early 1800s. And so there's never been a full biography written on him because there just isn't much known about him. Another Declaration of Independence signer who is buried in York County is Philip Livingston of the New York Livingstons. And that really is, it's a sign. I talked about all the strife that went on between the community and their visitors. Philip Livingston came down, and he was sick when he came down. He had some type of stomach issue. He left his loved ones in New York, knew he probably would never see him again, came down, and the whole month he was here before he died, he was in terrible pain. And he died and was given a state funeral and buried in York County. Never brought back to New York. His family to this day still comes down and visits his grave in York County, the extended Livingston family. But that shows the heroism that took place. We sometimes like to beat up on our statesmen, our founders, but it really was a sacrificial trip that he made. He really to the edge of the frontier. He wasn't going to Philadelphia. He came to York, and he died. Never got out of bed when he came here.
Now, one of the events that happened when Congress was in York was the Conway Cabal. What was that? And there is a statue of Lafayette holding a wine glass in York today. What does that reference?
Yeah, that's that was a loose-knit conspiracy. There's a lot of different debates about him. In support of Horatio Gates, who was a victor at Saratoga, some people say that's the turning point of the American Revolution. It happened when Congress was in York in 1777. So, so that happened. And so Washington, meanwhile, wasn't winning battles at that point in the war. So people were really getting behind Horatio Gates and were looking to overthrow Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So how strong that conspiracy was, we don't know. But, there's different theories on that. But what is known is that Lafayette did come to York in 1778. He represented France, he represented Washington, came there. There was a toast. And Gates was there, and other of his supporters were there, and they toasted everybody but Washington. And Lafayette, as the story goes, and I believe the story because it was in his diary, he said, "We've forgotten someone. I'm toasting George Washington." And at that point, some people would say that at that point the Conway Cabal dissolved. It really was already waning at that point, but his vote for Washington certainly meant something.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, if you go into York today, there are some historic sites related to the Continental Congress there. What would people see?
Yeah, there's a replica courthouse there that was built in 1976 on the 200th anniversary, and that's really the kind of an epicenter if you want to study about the Continental Congress and the American Revolution. I would say that there's going to be a reawakening and interest in Marquis de Lafayette next year because, this was the 200th anniversary of his return to America, and that's a big deal throughout America, even this year, because he came in 1824, and he stayed. It took him a year to tour all America at that time, and so he reached York in 1825, and he came to York, went to Harrisburg, came back to York, given a big toast, and so. And even whenever he died in France in 1834, York County had a funeral for him. So the place to study Lafayette is when you come to York County in the American Revolution, again, is that colonial courthouse. But also the York County History Center has a new museum and there's a American Revolution component to that museum. But also they have what's called the Golden Plough Tavern in Gates House. The Gates House is where Horatio Gates stayed, and it's believed that that's where the toast took place, on the upper floor of that house. So if you, they're seasonal, but if you go at the right time, all those sites that I mentioned are within a block of each other.
Now, given York's location with Baltimore south and Harrisburg to the north, as well as Philadelphia to the east, it becomes kind of a crossroads town where you end up with a lot of different transportation networks working through there. How important are these networks to York's development?
Well, just to stay on the American Revolution for a second, that was one of the things that if you look at a map of York, roads are going in all directions. And it was that first county west of the Susquehanna, so you would need to have networks so people could move around after they got across the river. So another component of those networks was the Great Wagon Road that I mentioned. And along that road, there'd be businesses that would start, that would service, the people on the road. For example, gunsmiths. So the Pennsylvania or Kentucky long rifle, for example, was made there. It was made elsewhere in Pennsylvania, but it was made along that Great Wagon Road. Also, wagon making was a big deal, and wheel making, and blacksmiths, and things like that. And so, interestingly, around the 1900, some entrepreneurs in York went and took these wagons and put a motor on them, and they had an early automobile. And so York County had produced thousands of automobiles between about 1900 and World War I, whenever it kind of the war kind of ended that effort. So, so automobile making grew up along that as well. It was so the roads kind of spawned businesses that spawned other businesses, and really helped define York in many ways. Those transportation networks also were a reason why York, if you go to York, you'll still see these red brick factories around. York was benefited greatly from the Industrial Revolution because of these transportation systems. The Northern Central Railroad that we mentioned a little bit earlier was a major player between Baltimore and Harrisburg and many other points. And so it was a short distance from York to to Baltimore via that railroad. So that caused all kinds of cultural connections with Baltimore, but also market connections with Baltimore as well. That railroad eventually went across the bridge in Wrightsville, over to Lancaster and Philadelphia as well. So the transportation system really was a major part of York County's past.
Now, one of the figures you mentioned visiting York County in the 1840s was novelist Charles Dickens. What was he doing in the United States, and did he write about what his experiences were in York County?
Yeah, he came to York, and he was doing a tour of the United States, taking in this time Pennsylvania, and he stayed overnight in York. He ate breakfast there, and he got on what was a major conveyance called a barge. It was a carriage with a bunch of other folks, and went from York up to Harrisburg. He gave us a brilliant description, as only Dickens would, of going up along the Susquehanna, and the greenery and the rocks in the Susquehanna, and just a view of kind of primitive Pennsylvania in the 1840s.
Now, another key figure in the community was William Goodrich. Who was he?
Yeah, William Goodrich was a freedman. Came to Pennsylvania, gained his, fulfilled his apprenticeship, and he started a business in the 1820s, and that business continued through the end of the Civil War. He was a freedman, an ex-slave. And he was respected in the community. And part of what he did was there's evidence, a lot of evidence, that he was involved in the Underground Railroad. And so he was a station master. In fact, there's a house museum, his former house, that operates today, in which has a dugout cellar where it's believed that he harbored freedom seekers. one of the things I mentioned earlier about with York County with this 40-mile border at that moment, with Maryland was it was a major way for freedom seekers to cross the Mason-Dixon line and try to get across the Susquehanna, Lancaster, and Philadelphia in their freedom. And so with that wide border, the Underground Railroad was a major center, a major activity in York County, and William C. Goodrich was kind of at the center of that. He had the wherewithal to own a railroad line, which meant he had railroad cars that ran along the line to Lancaster and Philadelphia, and so there was secret compartments in those cars that he could bring people to their freedom. So he was a Renaissance man in many ways, successful, ran into some bankruptcy problems, as many businessmen does, came out the other side and stayed in business, and then he moved on to Michigan and Minnesota in his later years.
Now, earlier we talked about the Wright's Ferry crossing the Susquehanna. At some point, the Susquehanna would be bridged at that location. When was the first bridge built there?
Yeah, that was a major moment. It was in 1814, and that bridge was near the bridge number 6 today. There's been 6 bridges there, and I'll spare folks a narrative on all 6 of the bridges. But the first bridge was near the Wright's Ferry Bridge, number 6. And the bridges were successively damaged or obliterated by an ice jam, a fire, and wind. And then the bridge number 4 was dismantled for scrap. The bridge that most people remember over there is bridge number 2. It was the Civil War bridge that Union forces burned to keep the Confederates from going across. And that was a major bridge because it brought the railroad across, it brought travelers across, pedestrians across, wagon traffic across, and it had a canal towpath across. So when that bridge went up in flames, it was a major loss, but it kept the Confederates at bay. The bridge number 6 that's there today, that's the modern Wright's Ferry Bridge that many people are familiar with. That bridge when it opened in 1972 was a major moment because it then allowed York County's more easy access to Lancaster County and vice versa. But as a rule of thumb, a lot of York counties wanted to go over the Park City Mall and shop. And so you could get over the Park City Mall from many points in York County faster than you can go over the western part of York County. So what I'm saying is it really, maybe for one of the first times, it was easy to get back and forth between the two counties.
Now, another cultural phenomena that took place in the years before the Civil War was the Chautauqua movement. How did that impact York?
Yeah, you would like to say it had a lasting impact. It was a moment in which the Chautauqua came into town, and they would meet, and people would go there. And so it does dispel this idea that this is a bunch of uneducated frontier farmers. The farmers in York County were educated and were very smart, and they would avail themselves of that. But one of the things that has worked against that, and I think what I believe is that York County, because of its size and population, had a large number of one-room schools. And some people would say, oh, that's nice and charming and so on, and it is. And I think it was number 1 or number 2 in the state at its peak, with 350 one-room schools. But what one-room schools didn't do was it didn't promote higher education. So York County didn't have a 4-year college until 1968. And think about Lancaster County for a second. Lancaster County had at least 3 4-year colleges, Millerville, F&M, and Elizabethtown, before 1968, way before 1968. So you have 2 counties on each side of the river, and you can see the disparity of higher education. That was because the folks in the one-room school, the students would quit after grade 8, kind of graduate to the farm or the factories. And so the downstream impact of that was that York County, York area, declined a request for a Carnegie Library in the early 1900s. York County didn't have a library York area didn't have a library until 1935. So the Chautauqua movement was a moment, but it's hard to see. It didn't have other things to sustain it, over the course of time.
So it was an effort of people to get together and talk about issues, or?
Yeah. There would be meetings. It was just a talk where they'd have speakers and meetings and questions and answers and breakouts, and in some cases there would be traveling museums that would come through York County with artifacts and so on. So there was those types of lyceum types of programs that would come through York County, and still do even to this day.
So you mentioned earlier about the burning of the Wrightsville Bridge during the Civil War. Let's talk more about the Civil War in York County, since it's next to Adams County, where the Battle of Gettysburg took place. What was the impact of the Civil War on York County?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll just say that not too many other counties, north or south, have had major roles in the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. World War II talked about the fact we were a major defense contractor, and those red brick factories were humming to make things of all kinds. In the Civil War, it was early in the war. It was a major camp before Camp Curtin came into play in Harrisburg. It was a major camp where you would train green troops. Then it moved up to Harrisburg. There was a major Civil War hospital there. 14,000 patients, Union soldiers mostly. Some Confederate soldiers were treated in that system. And then there was something like York County had 600 soldiers who died, and I've done the math. If you would multiply that times today's population, that'd be equivalent to 11,000 York Counties who died today. So it was a big sacrifice. In fact, the disruption of the families was so great that an orphanage was built in 1865 to accommodate that disruption, the orphans and those that were separated from their families. But there was another moment that took place that in many ways subsumed these major accomplishments. And I should add that there was a major cavalry battle in Hanover, and of course the burning of the bridge in Wrightsville. There was a battle before that. So the Confederates were coming across the county, trying to get across the Susquehanna, trying to go up to Harrisburg, and they were stopped on the west bank of the Susquehanna, and they retreated and fought in Harrisburg. But on their way into town, the town's fathers went out, crossed into enemy lines, and surrendered the town. They did it twice. They did a preliminary surrender, then a final surrender. The Confederates marched into town. They claimed later they were trying to save the town. But whenever you go and seek out an enemy in the theater of war, it's not a great moment. So the Civil War, in many ways, moved off the priority list when it came to teaching and talking about York County history for much of the 20th century. And I conclude from that, and I've written about this, that when you don't talk about the Civil War, you don't talk about slavery. And so those types of conversations weren't taking place for much of the 20th century in York County. So the memory of the Civil War for a lot of our history has been weak, and that has changed in the last 25 years. Now is probably the most popular topic, and interestingly, there's a lot of discussion now in York County about equity and the discrimination that's taken place in York County over the decades. So it's interesting how an event in history can shape the way you see things today.
Now, there was also a John Wilkes Booth connection to York County. How did he come about that?
Yeah, he was a student there in York County, was there, I believe, in the 1840s, 1850s, and he went to school there, and he apparently wasn't the best of students. In fact, a classmate later said about him that he had a yellow streak in him. And interestingly, he really grew up not far from York County, in Bel Air, Maryland. So he probably was in York County more often than we might know. But he definitely was there for school, as documented.
There was also a York County resident who apparently Booth had asked to hold his horse at Ford's Theater.
Yeah, that was Ned Spangler, who was down there. He was a stagehand down at at the theater, and there's a lot of different theories on whether he knew what he was doing at the time. But John Wilkes Booth asked him to hold the horse because he had to run inside for a second. Ned Spangler did so. John Wilkes Booth came out and rode off, and he was implicated in the murder of Abraham Lincoln, ended up serving, I think, 5 years in prison as a result of that, before he was freed.
Now, over the years, many presidents have visited York. Certainly, President James Buchanan, who was more of a local in the area. You tell the story about how you fell down while walking across the Wrightsville Bridge.
Yeah, there's talk today that we follow, the presidents. Every time they sneeze, we write about it. But in those days, there was coverage of the presidents as well in the newspapers, and often derisive coverage in the newspapers. The language is really strong, and verbose in those days, just like it is today. And there's one incident where James Buchanan, he would come up from Washington on a train, and he couldn't ride on the train across. The train had to be pulled across the covered bridge in Wrightsville. This is the bridge that later burned, because the sparks might catch the bridge on fire, so he had to pull it across. So he had a habit of walking across the mile long on his way to Wheatland, his home over in Lancaster County. And one time he slipped and fell, and the newspaper said he got up and he was okay. So that's the interesting story there. They noticed it, and they assured everybody that the president was okay. But York County, whenever the railroad went through in 1838, after 1838, between Baltimore and York and points beyond, there's more than 30 presidents that have visited York County. Via railroad, it was all the way from William Henry Harrison, I think it's 1841, to Richard Nixon in 1960. Richard Nixon made a tour there, late campaign tour, in 1860, and he's the last president. But there's been more than 30 presidents that have visited York County just because of our proximity to D.C., and we're on the way to everywhere else.
Now, one of the industries that thrived in York for a while was the cigar industry. How significant was that for York County?
Yeah, every town in York County had at least one cigar factory, and sometimes even a town today that would look almost deserted would have 3 or 4 or more. And what the beauty of, if you want to look at it this way, the beauty of the cigar factories was that you could, it was the American dream. You could, maybe someone in the household would work in a factory, and then someone else in the household could roll cigars all day. And they would do it on their kitchen table, or else they would develop sheds out back. And they would, and then they took a couple families would get together and say, let's combine our sheds and build a bigger building, then we would have a factory. So it just depended on how much work you wanted to put into it. Like Red Line, for example, if you go there today, you'll still, if you go in those back alleys, you'll still see, these old sheds that were at one time where people rolled cigars. And so what it did, it gave families liquidity that they could buy houses. So many places in York County, if you go to these small towns, there are wonderful, wonderfully designed houses you wouldn't expect to see in a farming community. The last cigar factory closed in York County about in the first decade of this century. And so before that, but at one time there were thousands rolling hundreds of millions of cigars. A downside of this was that the evidence shows that they were aware that nicotine could be addictive and harmful to your health, from smoking cigars early on. So it's an interesting paradox that York County built, many York counties built their fortunes on this industry that was seen at the time, as being harmful to health, the nicotine being addicting and so on. So we have all kinds of paradoxes in our counties, I believe.
Now, the 1920s, one of the national phenomena that was going on was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And you say in the book that York was a hotbed of Klan activity. Why? What was going on?
Yeah, I think many communities had this. When the Klan kind of had a resurgence after the Civil War, they were dominant, particularly in the South. In the 1920s, they had a resurgence, and what they tried to do is they tried to build themselves as a service club. So, and they were in churches. They built themselves as doing good in the community, and so they got members that maybe wouldn't ordinarily join. They joined for the brotherhood of it, and the women would join as well, or would be auxiliaries to these groups, and so they were a major force in the community. At that time, some believed they were more anti-Catholic than anti-Black, but there's no evidence that they had large numbers of Black members. In fact, they would have annual conventions where they would burn crosses. And, just imagine what the legacy of the burnt cross had in the minds of Black people and Catholics and others who weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Another key event that happened in your county, of course, was the New Deal. And one of the factors was Civilian Conservation Corps camp there. So what was that camp, and what role did it play in development in York County?
Yeah, that was a Glenview camp in Glen Rock. It was built on the hillside above Glen Rock, and that they would send out work crews to work all around. It was one of these alphabet soup agencies that created under the Roosevelt administration to provide really work for people. So people would come from all over to these camps, and the camps were organized in a military-style fashion. And they were Corps. And so it was one of the lasting evidences of it, other than the fact that they did works on state parks and so on, is that some of those at the camp stayed in the community and married in the community. So we have people in the community, in many communities in York County, particularly in Glen Rock today, who are related to these folks that came to Glen Rock to try to make their way through a tough time in America.
Another industry in the county was the silk industry. How did York County end up with the silk industry?
Yeah, York County was just good at making things, and we were near transportation networks. We were near near water. We had a good climate where you could grow the types of things that silkworms fed on, and but I think a lot of it had to do with just the trades that were going on in York County. I mentioned earlier that we were a community of trades and farmers, and so that type of work, running looms and making things, was kind of in the DNA of York County. And I want to emphasize that to do that, it just wasn't working with your hands. You had to work with your head and your heart. Some of the places like Dentsply that made artificial teeth, you'd have 4 generations of families working there, and still Dentsply is still in York area. So a lot of it just had to do with our proximity to markets, and you can see that even today in the amount of logistics or warehousing that goes on. If you're driving on 83 around York County, you'll see the warehouses. That's because York County is near all these markets, and that's always been an asset of York County.
Did in the 20th century we begin to see deindustrialization around Pennsylvania? Was that something that affected York as well?
Yeah, about in 1880, after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution really took off for some of the reasons that we've already talked about. And probably the apex of that happened was what I was referred to earlier, was the defense work that went on. It was called the York Plan. And, and what happened was that the leaders of the industry got together and said, okay, I have extra people. I don't have the machines. Someone said, I have the machines, but I don't have enough manpower. So they went and compared lists of manpower and machines, and these competing industries that competed for workers and other things up to that point, got together and said, we're not going to compete anymore. We're going to come together because we're fighting a two-front war. We have 20,000 of our men and women out in service. we got to contribute to this war. And besides that, it'll get us out of the Depression. They didn't say that way, but they were hungry for business and they were hungry for innovation. So this was a case where York County had all these tradesmen. They had all this capacity, all these factories, and what was a leader became a leader in America in making things. And the things they made they made munitions like ACAC guns and things like that, but they ended up making things like air conditioning that was needed to air condition ships to get that, to get food and other things across the oceans. So at one point there was some concern talking about your corporation, Johnson Controls today, that we're really not contributing. We're not making bullets. We're not making armaments. We're not making ordnance. And the leadership of the company said, this is a war of machines. This is a war of, we can help in this war by making things that keep the soldiers alive overseas.
So people read through your book and they read this vast history of this county. What do you want them to take away from an understanding of York County?
Yeah, I think it's this book is a study of how one county started and grew over the course of time, and the challenges one county faced over that time, and the successes gained by that county over time, successes, and how sometimes it learned from the very bad at worst of times. I mentioned the surrender, how that was a major moment, and there's been other moments as well that have been embarrassing, but sometimes those bad moments then bring redemptive things on the other side of those moments. So it's a story. It's a case study of a rural county, a large rural county in early America.
Jim McClure is the author of Never to Be Forgotten: A History of York County, Pennsylvania. Jim, thanks for joining me.
Okay. Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.